Hi, my name's Joni Ett-Mims. My study is called Rethinking Standardized Measures, a study on alternative assessments. So the purpose of my research was to compare the effectiveness of two of the primary assessment approaches used in early childhood education. The first assessment approach I included is a standardized test, which is an assessment method that requires students to all answer the same or comparable questions in the same way, and then their responses are scored in a standard way. And the second assessment approach I included is an authentic assessment, which involves observing children's performance in daily activities occurring in their real life environments, documenting their progress over time, and evaluating their individual strengths, skills, and knowledge. Assessments are used to monitor and evaluate children's development, inform teachers' instruction, evaluate program effectiveness, and support children's learning. So the assessments that educators and professionals use need to be valid, meaning that they measure what they're supposed to measure. They need to be reliable, meaning that there's consistency in the measurements from the assessment, and they need to be useful, meaning that they should provide helpful feedback for the teacher and the student. So this study provides a comprehensive comparison of two methods of assessment, each with their own purpose, and ultimately considers how these methods can both be used in a synergistic way. The first method that I included in my study is a standardized assessment called the Brigance Screen. This is a standardized developmental screening tool used in early childhood and early elementary education. Its main purpose is to quickly and accurately identify children who may be at risk for developmental delays, learning disabilities, or cognitive delays, as well as those who may be advanced or gifted. It is administered by a professional, usually a teacher or an administrator, in a one-to-one setting with the child who's being screened, and it typically takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. It assesses a child's development in several domains, including physical, language, cognitive, and social emotional skills. And the second method in my research study is called the Teaching Strategies Gold Assessment, or TSG is how I'll typically refer to it moving forward. This is a comprehensive assessment tool that's used in early childhood education. It uses an authentic observational approach to collecting evidence of a child's skills and behaviors. Um, the data is collected in one of the child's natural environments, which is typically going to be the child's classroom, and it assesses a child's development in 10 domains: social, emotional, physical, language, cognitive, literacy, mathematics, science and technology, social studies, the arts, and English language acquisitions if they're a dual language learner. So, like I said, these each have their own purpose. So they each have their place where they can be useful, but it might be necessary to use both so that educators and professionals can meet the systemic requirements in education, like screening and accountability, while also using the data to meet the needs of the students. In that case, that would mean that we're able to provide individualized, high quality instruction. But in this study, I looked at them separately to try to compare the effectiveness of how each of them are currently being used. So my research question is, how does authentic assessment in early childhood education compare to a standardized screening test when measuring the language development domain? I specifically chose the language development domain because both the Brigance and the TSG measure this domain, and they have comparable items that I felt like I could use to compare for each participant in the study. For my literature review, I first reviewed existing literature in order to define and compare authentic assessments and standardized tests. I defined these briefly in my introductory slide, but the review of existing literature provided me with a deeper understanding of each of these assessment methods. First, standardized tests require each student to respond to the same questions or prompts in the same way, and then those are scored in a standard way, which makes comparisons between the students possible. And that definition was from the Glossary of Education Reform in 2015. Standardized tests are generally considered to be one of the more objective methods of assessment, but they typically measure only academic skills without recognizing skills in some other critical developmental areas. So these tests are not likely to actually reflect students' abilities or knowledge. Then authentic assessments involve observing children's performance in daily activities occurring in their real life environments, documenting their progress over time, and evaluating their individual strengths, skills, and knowledge. And that definition was from Cook in 2004. These alternative, authentic assessments may provide a more comprehensive reflection of students' learning and abilities in early childhood education and are more frequently considered to be best practice for this age group. Becker and some others in 2023 said that authentic assessment is distinct from standardized tests because standards-based tests tend to pull children out of the learning process rather than observe them within it. Next, I reviewed existing literature regarding young children as active participants in their learning experiences. Young children are sometimes considered to be passive recipients of information, but research in early childhood education has discovered that early learners tend to be curious participants throughout their development who naturally prefer to explore and attempt to understand their environment. That was from a study by Rutgers in 2021. And then Green in 2015 specifically explored research as it relates to and potentially engages young children. So Green distinguished between research on children, which is impersonal and seems to assume children are incapable of understanding the research, and then research with children, where children are considered to be contributors to the study. And then Green even went a step further to define research by children, where children are engaged as the researchers or co-researchers. And while the youngest learners, like my preschoolers, for instance, might only be able to participate in research as contributors where, it's mostly an adult-led process, there should still be an emphasis on listening to the children and representing their perspectives. And then Graham and Fitzgerald in 2010 said that it is indeed what children have to say about their own participation that should inform the possibilities and limitations of their engagement in research related to their education and learning. And then finally, I reviewed existing literature regarding the challenges and solutions for implementing authentic assessments. Even if professionals and the evidence agree that authentic assessments are more appropriate for use in early childhood classrooms compared to standardized tests, there are still implementation challenges that need to be addressed. Gathering, analyzing, and using authentic assessment data takes time and training. And then effectively using the data to design instruction and individualized interventions for students requires planning and support. Boss, in a 2024 study, asserted that objectivity within authentic assessment procedures is impossible. And Hatherley and Sands in 2002 said, we can never stand outside our perceptions and values when we observe. So they're just commenting on sort of the subjective nature of assessments, especially authentic assessments. One of the foundational recommendations for addressing many of the current issues educators currently face, including the implementation of assessments, is to strengthen the support for early childhood educators and institutions. Lam and Wong in 2020 conducted a survey of preschool teachers, and their recommendations based on the survey results were to provide additional financial and manual support, including lowering the number of teaching hours in order to provide professionals the time and space for lesson planning and preparation, professional development, and reflective writing. And as a preschool teacher myself, I can say amen to all of that. For this study, I used a mixed methods approach, collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. The quantitative measure was the Brigant screen, the standardized test, and the qualitative measure was the Teaching Strategies Gold, which is the authentic assessment. Participants included 4-year-old students enrolled in a public preschool classroom, and the research was conducted in the classroom during regular school hours. Participants were selected by a random sample, and the sample size included at least 25% of the 4-year-old students in the classroom, which ended up being 5 students total. The materials I used for the qualitative data were the Brigance screen printed materials that I needed to administer the screener, and then the data sheets that I needed to record the individual students' responses. And the materials that I needed to implement and document the authentic assessments were basically classroom materials and then the TSG items for the language development domain, and those were accessible to me online through my school. For the procedures of the research study, I basically just needed to administer the Brigance screen to all participants and then conduct observations in order to assign their ratings on the TSG for each of the participants. And I wanted to have this all done within the first 9 weeks of the school year, which was mostly just for the timing of this research project and the class deadlines. The scoring on the Brigance involved tallying the correct responses from the child, calculating a composite score, and then comparing the composite score to standardized cutoff scores for the child's age. The results of the observation for the TSG were analyzed to identify patterns and insights into individual students' abilities, and then comparisons between the two groups of data focused on the overall achievement just in the language development domain. Limitations in this study include the small sample size and the non-experimental design of the study. Only one standardized screener was used, and only data from one instance of that test was collected. The authentic assessments from the TSG are going to be repeated 2 more times later on in this academic year, but those results won't be available for this study. And then just the individualized nature of authentic assessments and their implementation can introduce some variability into the data. So again, the purpose of this study was to compare the effectiveness of 2 of the primary assessment approaches used in early childhood education: standardized tests and authentic assessments. The focus of the research was to answer the following question: how does authentic assessment, such as TSG, in early childhood education compare to a standardized screening test, such as the Brigance, when measuring the language development domain? And I will discuss the findings on the next several slides. So I first administered the Brigance screener to each participant, which includes 2 items related to language development. Item 2A is called Names Parts of the Body. This measures expressive and receptive language in the child. And then item 13A on the Brigance is called Verbal Fluency and Articulation, which measures speech sounds and language output. So for the names parts of the body item, item 2A, I pointed to 6 different parts of the body: thumbs, fingernails, chin, chest, elbows, and shoulders. And I asked the participant to name each part as I pointed to it by saying, "What is this?" And then, so the results of this item are on the next slide. The results of item 2A, names parts of the body, showed that 1 participant named all 6 body parts correctly. That was student 3. 2 participants were able to name 5 of the 6 correctly. Student 1 named every part except for fingernails, and student 5 named every part except for chest. 1 participant named 4 correctly. That was student 2. They were able to name every part except for fingernails and chest. And then 1 participant named 3 correctly. So student 4 named thumbs, chin, and elbows correctly. So the participants who were able to name all or most of the body parts correctly exhibited typical development in receptive language, which is the ability to understand spoken language, and expressive language, which is the ability to generate and communicate a message. For the participant who was only able to name half of the body parts correctly, the Brigance screener really doesn't provide enough information for me to know if the child is struggling with receptive language, expressive language, or simply did not know the correct names of those body parts. For the verbal fluency and articulation item, I conversed with each participant in order to discern if the child was able to use sentences of at least 5 words and if at least 90% of the child's speech was intelligible. I began by asking each participant the same question, but I allowed each conversation to flow naturally according to the child's initial response. I used a recent classroom lesson on red, green, and yellow apples. Students had been able to taste each color of the apple, and we compared flavors and textures, etc. So that's how I began the conversation with each participant. I said, "Tell me about the activity we just did with apples in our classroom." And then as each participant responded, I marked on the Brigance data sheet whether they were using sentences of 5 words or more, and if at least 90% of their speech was intelligible. And the results of this item are on the next slide. So the results of item 13A, verbal fluency and articulation, showed that 4 out of the 5 participants were able to use sentences of at least 5 words. Those are students 1, 2, 3, and 5. And all participants spoke that at least 90% of their speech was intelligible. This meant that 4 out of the 5 participants received full credit on this item, 10 out of 10 points, and 1 participant, student 4, received half credit, which was 5 out of 10 points. I also administered the full TSG assessment to each participant. This includes 8 items related to the language development domain, and 3 of these 8 items correlated closely to the 2 language development items on the Brigance screen. So these were the 3 that I've included in this study. The first item on the TSG that I included was item 8A, which is comprehends language. To administer this item, I interacted with each participant during free play time in the classroom using materials from the Math Manipulative Center or the Kitchen Dramatic Play Center. Using math manipulatives, I might have asked the participant to find the animals that have stripes. Using materials from the kitchen, I might ask each participant to show me what we used to mix the ingredients. That varied a little bit depending on the child and their interests. And then I documented the skills of each participant on the TSG assessment scale during these interactions, and the results of this item are on the next slide. The participants were rated on a scale from 0 to 8, and indicators are labeled on the even rating numbers. So level 0 is described as not yet. Level 2 is shows interest in the speech of others. Level 4 is identifies familiar people, animals, and objects when prompted. Level 6 is responds appropriately to specific vocabulary and simple statements, questions, and stories. And level 8 is responds appropriately to complex statements, questions, vocabulary, and stories, asking questions when needed, offers opposites for frequently occurring verbs and adjectives, understands the differences between similar action verbs. And then, so on the TSG, the odd level ratings, so in this case 1, 3, 5, and 7, don't carry their own indicators, but they do represent skill development in between the even numbered ratings. So for item 8A, 2 participants were rated at a level 7, students 1 and 3. 2 students were at level 6, that's students 2 and 5, and 1 student was at level 5, and that was student 4. So the TSG progression for this dimension indicated that students who received ratings of 6 or 7, so that'd be students 1, 2, 3, and 5, scored at a typical developmental level for 4-year-old preschoolers, while the rating of a 5 that student 4 received indicated a developmental level most typically seen in 3-year-old children. For item 9B speaks clearly, I interacted with each participant during free play time in the classroom, noting the intelligibility of their speech when using spontaneous language in conversations, and the results from this item are on the next slide. So 2 participants were scored at level 7, 2 students at level 6, and 1 student at level 5. And the TSG progression for this dimension indicated that students who received ratings of 6 or 7 scored at a typical developmental level for 4-year-old preschoolers, while the rating of 5, which was student 4, indicated a developmental level most typically seen in 3-year-old children. So in order to administer the next item on the TSG, item 9C, which is uses conventional grammar, I looked for the correct use of word endings like plurals and verb tenses and sentence structure, including the appropriate use of subjects, verbs, and pronouns. This again involved authentic observations of each participant's spontaneous conversation during free play time in the classroom, and the results of this item are on the next slide. So one participant was rated at level 7, three students were at level 6, and one student was at level 5. And the TSG progression for this dimension indicated that students who received ratings of 5, 6, or 7, which was all of these participants, scored at a developmental level for 4-year-old preschoolers. So in summary, after I compared the results of the Brigance to the TSG ratings for each participant, critical differences were identified between the two assessment methodologies, especially regarding the depth and relevance of the data provided by each tool. The Brigance includes 13 total items, and only 2 of those are specific to the language development domain, while the TSG includes 38 core objectives, and many of those include additional dimensions. So we end up scoring our students on something like 75 items for the TSG. The language objective itself on the TSG includes 8 dimensions on which students are scored, providing a little bit of breadth and depth that the Brigance lacked. And while the Brigance screen has demonstrated high reliability in measuring overall development and identifying students who are delayed or potentially at risk for delay, I found the TSG assessment to be a more powerful tool for informing my instruction and for providing meaningful information to families. The TSG report also provides an optional ability statement for each specific dimension that was dependent on the student's individualized results. So this type of information would be helpful for classroom teachers and planning future instruction, and it might be equally helpful for the students' families. For instance, if a parent learned from the Brigance screener that their child correctly named 5 out of 6 of the tested body parts, that likely is not as informative as reading the following ability statement from the TSG report for a similar dimension, which says, currently, student 1 is beginning to respond appropriately to complex statements, questions, vocabulary, and stories, asking questions when needed, offering opposites for frequently occurring verbs and adjectives, and understanding the difference between similar action verbs. So because the TSG is used as a formative assessment, students' development can be tracked over time, which supports teachers as they plan instructional next steps, and it provides more relevant information to both teachers and families of these students. For limitations, I identified 2 specific limitations of the current study. First, because only one teacher implemented the authentic assessments, which was me, this likely resulted in some subjectivity in the outcomes for each participant. And then more reliable data could be obtained by research that includes more than one professional assessing each student and then comparing results to ensure inter-rater reliability. And the second limitation is really a result of the narrow focus of the study, which involved data collection of only the language development domain items. The current research could be replicated to study other early childhood developmental domains, such as the physical, cognitive, and social emotional domains, in order to compare the effects of authentic assessments and standardized tools in those as well. For implications and recommendations, I think future research in this area should advance beyond simply comparing different assessment methods and begin to focus on how best to provide individualized, high-quality instruction in early childhood education. My study showed that each assessment method, authentic and standardized, can be useful in their own ways, depending on the kind of data that's needed. Therefore, if schools and educators continue to use multiple methods of assessment, which is likely, then future research should focus on how the results from all assessment tools can be integrated to create a more comprehensive evaluation of students and more meaningful guidance for educators and families as they support children's development. In conclusion, the information found through this study suggests that authentic assessment methods such as TSG provide a deeper and more valuable measurement of students' abilities in the language development domain compared to data produced by a standardized measurement tool like the Brigance. Authentic assessment methods are better able to evaluate all students individually and are more useful to determining the skill level, knowledge, strengths, and weaknesses of students. Once teachers and parents are in possession of this information, they'll have a more complete and accurate representation of a child's development, motivations, and areas of opportunity for further growth. These were my references if you're interested in looking through any of those. And that is my presentation. I appreciate your time and attention.